When a billionaire's world of wealth and control meets a moment of unexpected courage. One simple act under a diner table changes a father, a son, and their lives forever. Daniel Carter was the kind of man whose name alone carried weight in business circles. Newspapers wrote about him, magazines praised his achievements, television channels called him one of the most influential men in the country. He was a billionaire, a man who had built a vast empire from scratch. People admired his intelligence, his determination, and his ability to turn every venture into gold. But for all the wealth he had gathered, Daniel often sat in his office late at night, feeling a strange emptiness that money could never fill. Years ago, when Daniel's wife Emily was alive, things had been different. Emily had been the glue that held their small family together. She was gentle where Daniel was sharp, patient where he was restless, and warm where he was cold. Their son Ethan, who had been just a little boy when she passed away, had adored her. Emily's presence had softened Daniel's hard edges, reminding him that life was not only about deals, contracts, and profits, but also about laughter at the dinner table and bedtime stories read in a gentle voice. When she died unexpectedly after a short illness, everything shifted. Daniel buried himself in work as if money could shield him from grief. Ethan was left with nannies, tutors, and house staff, none of whom could replace the love of a parent. The years went on, Daniel's empire grew, but so did the distance between him and his son. Ethan became a quiet, thoughtful boy who learned not to expect too much from his father. He would wait for Daniel to come home, but most nights the boy fell asleep before hearing his father's footsteps. Birthdays were celebrated with expensive gifts, but without the warmth of a father's presence. School events often passed with Ethan scanning the crowd, hoping to see Daniel's face, only to be disappointed time and again. Deep down, Daniel loved his son more than anything. He remembered holding him for the first time in the hospital, his tiny fingers gripping Daniel's thumb as if refusing to let go. He remembered Emily whispering, "Take care of him no matter what." But in the whirlwind of running $1 billion business, he convinced himself that providing wealth was the same as providing love. He told himself that someday, when things settled, he would spend more time with Ethan. Someday never seemed to come. On one chilly afternoon, Daniel found himself sitting in his sleek black car outside Ethan's school. His driver waited quietly at the wheel while Daniel scrolled through his phone, checking emails. He rarely picked up his son personally, but that day, his meeting in the nearby town had ended earlier than expected.
Oh, yes.
And he thought it would be a pleasant surprise. When Ethan spotted the car, his eyes widened. For a moment, the boy hesitated, almost not believing it was really his father there. Then he walked quickly toward the car, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. "Dad," Ethan said softly. As he opened the door, Daniel looked up and smiled, though it was the kind of smile that seemed practice rather than natural. "Hey, champ, how was school?" Ethan nodded. It was okay. He climbed into the car and sat beside his father, holding onto his backpack as if it were a shield. For a few minutes, silence filled the car. Daniel returned to his phone, typing quick replies, while Ethan stared out the window. The boy wanted to talk, wanted to share about the drawing he had made in art class, or the game of soccer during recess. But he wasn't sure if his father would really listen. He had tried before, only to be met with distracted nods and short answers. As they drove through the small town, Ethan's stomach growled softly. He hadn't eaten much at lunch, too nervous about a class presentation. Daniel noticed and, for once, put his phone down. "Are you hungry?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. Daniel glanced out the window. They passed by a small diner with a neon sign flickering in the daylight. It wasn't the kind of place Daniel normally visited. He was more accustomed to fine restaurants with white tablecloths and elegant menus, but something about the simplicity of it felt right for the moment. "Let's stop here," Daniel said. The driver pulled over, and both father and son stepped out. The diner smelled of freshly brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and warm bread. The atmosphere was cozy, with red booths, checkered floors, and the hum of conversation. A waitress with tired eyes but a kind smile greeted them and led them to a corner. Booth. Ethan slid into the seat, his small hands fidgeting on the table. Daniel sat across from him, adjusting his expensive watch. They looked like two people who knew each other, but hadn't really spoken in a long time. The waitress handed them menus, though Ethan mostly stared at the pictures rather than the words. "What do you want to eat?" Daniel asked, scanning the menu quickly. Maybe pancakes?" Ethan replied softly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "For lunch?" Ethan nodded, almost apologetically. Daniel chuckled lightly. "All right, pancakes it is." He ordered for both of them, choosing a sandwich for himself. As they waited for the food, Daniel tried to start a conversation. "So how's school going?" Ethan shrugged. "It's okay. Any new friends?" "A few," Ethan said, still looking down at the table. The answers were short, not because Ethan had nothing to say, but because he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between them. He wanted his father to ask more, to really listen, but years of silence had taught him not to expect too much. Daniel watched his son quietly, noticed how the boy avoided eye contact, how his shoulders seemed a little too heavy for someone so young. A pang of guilt twisted inside him. He realized he barely knew the details of Ethan's life, his favorite subjects, his dreams, his fears. For all the billions in his bank account, he couldn't buy back the time he had lost with his son. The waitress returned with their food, placing the pancakes in front of Ethan and the sandwich before Daniel. She smiled at Ethan, ruffling his hair lightly. "Those look good, don't they?" Ethan smiled back, a genuine one that lit up his face in a way Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. For a moment, Daniel felt like an outsider watching someone else connect with his child. He picked up his sandwich, but barely tasted it, his mind swirling with thoughts he had long tried to avoid. As Ethan poured syrup over his pancakes and began eating with delight, Daniel found himself studying him, the way his eyes lit up at simple things, the way he chewed thoughtfully, the way he seemed both young and older than his years. He realized how much of Ethan's life he had missed, and for the first time in a long while, he wondered if his priorities had been all wrong. That afternoon in the diner was ordinary on the surface. Sighed Daniel, something began to stir. It was the faintest whisper of change. The beginning of a story that would soon alter both his life and his son's in ways he never expected. Under the soft glow of the diner lights, Daniel and Ethan sat quietly at their booth. Ethan had finished most of his pancakes, his plate sticky with syrup, while Daniel picked at the last bite of his sandwich. The boy seemed happier than he had in weeks, but the silence between them lingered like an invisible wall. Daniel thought about how many times he had wanted to talk to his son, only to let business calls or urgent meetings pull him away. Now, watching Ethan's small hands carefully wipe his mouth with a napkin, Daniel wished he knew the right words to close the distance between them. The waitress, whose name tag read Lily, returned to check on them. She was young, probably, in her mid-20s, with kind eyes that carried a mixture of warmth and weariness. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and there was a smudge of flour on her apron. Yet her smile was genuine, the sort that made people feel welcome, no matter who they were. She leaned down slightly, looking at Ethan. "Pancakes good?" she asked cheerfully. Ethan nodded eagerly, his face lighting up. "They're the best I've had." Lily laughed softly. "I'll have to tell the cook you said that. He'll be proud." She turned her attention to Daniel for a moment, her eyes scanning his expensive suit and polished shoes, then back to Ethan. "You're lucky your dad brought you here today. Not everyone gets to have pancakes for lunch." Ethan smiled again. But Daniel caught the subtle weight in Lily's tone. It was as if she had noticed the distance between father and son, the way Ethan leaned toward her more easily than toward him. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling a quiet judgment he couldn't quite shake. Ethan, on the other hand, felt drawn to Lily. She asked questions that made him feel noticed in a way his father often didn't. She asked what grade he was in, what subjects he liked best, and what he wanted to do when he grew up. Ethan answered shyly at first, but soon his words flowed more easily. "I like drawing," Ethan admitted, his fingers tracing invisible lines on the table. "Sometimes I draw superheroes. Sometimes just animals." "Really?" Lily said, her eyes widening with interest. "That's wonderful. Do you carry a sketchbook with you?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I just draw on school paper or at home when I can." "You should get a sketchbook," Lily encouraged. "That way you can keep all your drawings together. Who knows? Maybe one day people will pay to see them." Ethan's cheeks flushed with excitement, the kind that comes when someone believes in you. Daniel watched quietly, realizing with a dull ache that he hadn't known his son liked to draw. He had never asked. He had assumed Ethan's world was being taken care of by tutors and teachers, never considering the details that shaped his child's dreams. For a few moments, Daniel felt invisible at the table, as if Lily had stepped in too, the role he should have been filling. He cleared his throat and forced a smile. "Drawing is a good skill, Ethan. Creative people do well in business too, you know?" Ethan nodded politely, but his attention remained on Lily, who winked at him as if they shared a small secret. Daniel sat back in his seat, his phone buzzing in his pocket. Normally, he would have answered immediately, but something about the moment made him let it ring. The sound of the diner suddenly shifted as the bell above the door jingled. Two men walked, in their presence changing the atmosphere almost instantly. They weren't dressed like the other customers. One wore a black jacket with torn sleeves, his hair messy, and his eyes darting around suspiciously. The other was taller, with a heavy beard and a scowl that made him look unfriendly. They walked with an air of carelessness, yet there was something deliberate in the way their eyes scanned the room. Daniel noticed it immediately. His instincts sharpened from years of negotiating with powerful men. These two were not there for food. He watched them out of the corner of his eye as they slid into a booth near the entrance, speaking in low voices Ethan hadn't noticed yet. He was busy drawing shapes with his finger in the condensation on his glass of water, but Lily's smile faded slightly as her gaze flicked toward the men. She carried a coffee pot to another table, though her movements were slower, more cautious. When she returned to Daniel and Ethan's booth, she lowered her voice. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her tone softer, almost protective. Daniel gave her a curious look, then glanced toward the men. "Do they come here often?" he asked quietly. Lily shook her head. "Never seen them before. Something about them feels off." Before Daniel could respond, Ethan looked up at them both. "What's wrong?" he asked innocently, sensing the shift in their expressions. "Nothing," Daniel said quickly, forcing calm into his voice. "Just nothing to worry about." But Ethan wasn't convinced. He glanced toward the entrance and noticed the two men staring at the counter where the cash register sat. One of them tapped his fingers against the table impatiently. Ethan's stomach tightened. The hum of the diner continued, but the air felt heavier now, as if everyone was quietly aware of the tension. A man reading a newspaper in the corner lowered it slightly, keeping an eye on the newcomers. A mother with two small children held them a little closer. Ethan shifted in his seat, eyes flicking back to Lily for reassurance. She noticed that fear starting to creep into his expression, and without thinking, she reached out to touch his shoulder gently. "Don't worry," she whispered with a small smile. "You're safe here." Daniel watched the gesture, feeling both grateful and strangely helpless. Who's used to being in control, the man who solved problems with money and authority. But here, in this small diner, faced with something he couldn't predict or manage, he felt out of his depth. The men at the entrance stood suddenly, and the scrape of their chairs echoed through the diner. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. They began walking slowly toward the counter, one of them glancing around as if daring anyone to interfere. Daniel's hand tightened into a fist beneath the table. He looked at Ethan, whose wide eyes showed rising panic. Lily crouched slightly, her body leaning closer to the boy. In that tense moment, she made a decision. She whispered, almost too quietly for Daniel to hear, "Ethan, come with me. Let's hide, just in case." Ethan blinked, startled. "Hide? Under the table?" "Yes," she said calmly, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Just for a little while. Ethan looked at his father, unsure. Daniel hesitated, torn between telling his son to stay put and admitting that Lily's instinct might be right. Finally, he gave a small nod. Lily gently pulled Ethan down from his seat, guiding him beneath the table where the shadows felt safer. The boy crawled beside her, pressing close as she whispered soothing words to keep him calm. Daniel remained seated, his eyes fixed on the men near the counter. But his heart raced at the sight of his son clinging to someone else for protection, for the first time in years. Daniel realized how powerless he truly was, not as a billionaire. Not as a businessman, but as a father who had failed to be the one his son turned to when fear struck. The space beneath the booth felt small and dark, but to Ethan, it became a hiding place where he clung tightly to Lily's arm. His small body trembled as he pressed himself against her, listening to the heavy thuds of boots moving across the diner floor. The smell of syrup and coffee mixed with the faint scent of Lily's apron, and though the world above seemed tense and frightening, her voice was a soft thread of comfort that held him steady. She whispered, leaning close, so only he could hear. "It's okay. Just stay quiet. I'm right here with you." Her words worked like magic on Ethan, calming the panic that had started to rise inside him. He peeked out through the narrow gap between the booth's red vinyl seat and the floor, catching glimpses of the men near the counter. One of them banged a hand on the register, and the sharp sound made Ethan flinch. He buried his face against Lily's side, squeezing his eyes shut, above the table.
Daniel.
Daniel sat rigid, his hands clenched tightly on his knees. His usual confidence, the confidence that carried him through boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations, had vanished. In this moment, he wasn't a billionaire or a man of power. He was just a father watching his son hide beneath a table with a stranger because he hadn't been the one his boy instinctively turned to. That truth cut deeper than the fear of whatever those men might do next. Daniel tried to steady his breathing. As he glanced toward the counter, the shorter of the two men barked something at the cashier, his voice harsh and impatient. The young cashier's hand shook as she fumbled with the buttons on the register, her face pale. The taller man stood. Nearby, his hand tucked inside his jacket pocket, as if ready to pull something out. The other diners sat frozen, afraid to move or make a sound. Ethan whispered into Lily's sleeve, "Are they going to hurt us?" Lily stroked his hair gently, her heart aching at the fear in his voice. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. Though she wasn't entirely sure herself, "We'll be okay. Just stay quiet. Close your eyes if you're scared." Ethan nodded against her, clutching her arm tighter. Daniel's throat felt dry as he watched. He had built a life where he was always in control, where money solved problems and people obeyed his decisions. But here, his wealth meant nothing. He couldn't throw money at these men to make them leave. Couldn't negotiate with them like business partners. He could only sit there, powerless, as his son found safety in someone else's embrace. The realization stung. He remembered Ethan as a toddler, clinging to his legs whenever he came home from work, desperate for his attention. He remembered Emily telling him, "He needs you to be present, not just to provide." And he remembered brushing it aside, believing that all the long hours and business trips were sacrifices for Ethan's future. But now, in this diner, with danger just a few feet away, he saw the truth with painful clarity. His son needed him in ways money could never fill. The sound of shouting pulled Daniel back to the present. The shorter man slammed the cash register shut, grabbing the bills stuffed inside. The cashier whimpered, and a glass somewhere behind the counter shattered as it fell. The taller man's eyes scanned the room again, and for a terrifying moment, his gaze lingered on Daniel's booth. Daniel's chest tightened as he fought to keep his expression calm. Under the table, Ethan felt Lily squeeze his hand. "Out," she whispered. Again, her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her chest. "You're so brave. Just a little longer, okay? We'll be fine." Her calmness amazed Daniel. She had no reason to protect his son. She didn't know them anything. And yet, in this moment, she was giving Ethan the comfort Daniel hadn't managed to give in years. He envied her courage. He envied the trust Ethan had placed in her so easily. Ethan whispered something so soft that Daniel almost missed it. Wish my mom was here. Lily's heart broke at the words. She leaned closer, brushing her hand gently over his shoulder. I know, sweetheart, but you're not alone. I'm here, and your dad's right here too. We'll get through this together. Daniel felt the words pierce through him. He had thought of Emily countless times since her death. But hearing Ethan say it so quietly, so desperately, made the grief feel fresh again. He wanted to reach under the table to hold his son, but Ethan clung tighter to Lily, and Daniel couldn't bring himself to interrupt the fragile sense of safety she had created. The men at the counter began to argue with each other, their voices rising. One wanted to leave quickly, the other insisted on taking more. Their bickering filled the diner, the tension growing thicker with every word. A baby began to cry at a nearby table, the sound sharp and shrill in the silence. The taller man spun around, glaring. "Shut that kid up," he barked. The baby's mother clutched her child, her eyes wide with terror. Ethan trembled beneath the table, pressing his face harder against Lily's arm. She hushed him softly, rocking him gently as if he were her own little brother. Her steady presence was the only thing holding his fear at bay. Daniel's fists clenched tighter. He had never felt so useless in his life. He wanted to stand, to protect his son, to show Ethan that he was more than just a provider. But he froze, his body betraying him. Fear held him down in his seat, and the shame of it burned inside him. Minutes stretched like hours until finally, the men grabbed what they could and rushed out the door, the bell above it jingling violently. Tires screeched outside as they sped away. For a long moment, no one in the diner moved. The silence was broken only by the sound of the crying baby, muffled against its mother's shoulder. Lily slowly lifted her head, listening for any sign that the men might return. When she was sure they were gone, she gently coaxed Ethan out from under the table. His face was pale, his eyes wide and watery, but he clung to her hand as if letting go would bring the fear back. Daniel exhaled shakily, relief washing over him. He reached for his son, but Ethan instinctively leaned closer to Lily, holding onto her arm. Daniel froze, the rejection cutting deeper than any wound. He forced himself to smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's over," Daniel said. Softly, his voice hoarse. "They're gone." Ethan nodded, but he didn't move away from Lily. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, whispering, "See, I told you we'd be okay." For Daniel, the moment was shattering. His son had found courage in the arms of a stranger, while he, the father who was supposed to be a protector, had sat frozen. The weight of that truth pressed down on him as he watched. Ethan's small fingers clinged desperately to Lily's sleeve. It was then that Daniel understood something he had ignored for too long. His son didn't just need a father who provided money and security from afar. He needed a father who was present in the moments that mattered, who could be the safe place when the world felt frightening. Daniel realized with painful clarity that he hadn't been that father not for years. And as he sat there, watching Ethan draw comfort from someone else, Daniel silently promised himself that things had to change. Because if he didn't, he would lose his son in ways far greater than he ever imagined. The diner was quiet after the two men left, but the silence felt heavy, as if everyone inside was still holding their breath. Slowly, the tension began to fade, though the fear had not yet left anyone's eyes. The cashier stood frozen behind the counter, clutching the register drawer as though it might vanish from her trembling hands. A man with a newspaper set it aside, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. Parents held their children closer, whispering promises that everything was all right now. But the atmosphere was still thick with unease, like smoke that lingered. Even after the fire was gone, Daniel sat in the booth, his body stiff, his mind racing. His heart still pounded in his chest. Every sound in the diner seemed louder than it should have been. The clink of a spoon against a coffee cup, the nervous cough of a man at the next table, the faint hum of the overhead lights. He turned his eyes toward Ethan, who was still pressed against Lily's side, holding on to her as though she were his anchor in a storm. That image cut deeper into Daniel than anything else had that day. His son hadn't reached for him, hadn't crawled into his father's arms when fear gripped him. Instead, he had chosen a stranger, a waitress, because she had been the one to protect him when Daniel could not. Lily crouched down beside Ethan, her voice gentle and calm. "It's all over now, sweetheart. You did so well. You were so brave." She brushed her fingers through his hair, smiling softly despite the nervous tremor in her own hands. Ethan looked up at her with eyes full of trust, eyes that glistened, as though he might cry but didn't. He nodded slowly and whispered, "I was scared." "Of course you were," she said kindly. "But you were brave anyway. That's what matters." Daniel swallowed hard. He wanted to say something to remind Ethan that his father was there too, but the words stuck in his throat. He felt like a shadow in his own child's world, sitting across the table yet miles away from his son's heart. Other customers began to stir, talking in low voices about calling the police. Someone stepped outside to check if the coast was clear. Within minutes, the wail of sirens filled the air, growing louder until red and blue lights flashed through the diner's windows. Police officers hurried inside, their radios crackling, their eyes scanning the room as people began explaining what had happened. Daniel watched as Lily gave a clear, steady account to the officers. She described the two men, their clothing, their voices, their actions. Though she was young and had been frightened herself, she spoke with a calmness that impressed everyone listening. Daniel couldn't help but admire her, though he also felt a sting of shame that she had shown more courage in front of his son than he had. Ethan clung to Lily's hand the whole time, his small fingers refusing to let go. Even when a police officer crouched down to ask him if he was all right, Ethan only nodded shyly and pressed closer to Lily. Daniel felt invisible, like a ghost haunting the edges of the moment. He tried to smile at his son, but Ethan didn't notice. When the police left, taking statements and reassuring everyone that the suspects would be caught, the diner slowly began to return to life. The cashier wiped her eyes, shaky but relieved. Families gathered their children and left quickly, eager to escape the place where they had felt so much fear. But Daniel remained in the booth with Ethan and Lily, unable to move, unable to shake the image of his son hiding beneath the table with someone else. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat and spoke, his voice low. "Thank you," he said to Lily, "for what you did back there, for keeping him calm." Lily looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Anyone would have done the same," she replied softly. But Daniel knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have reacted the way she had. Not everyone would have crouched down in the middle of danger and wrapped a child in comfort. It took something special, something he realized he had been missing in himself for far too long. Ethan turned his face toward his father for the first time since the men had left. "Dad?" he asked, his voice small. "Yes, son?" Daniel answered quickly, leaning forward as though afraid of losing the chance. "Can she come with us? Just for a little while?" Ethan looked at Lily, then back at his father, hope shining. In his eyes, "I like her." The words struck Daniel like a blow. His son, who rarely asked him for anything, was begging for this woman's presence. It wasn't about the pancakes or the excitement of the day. It was about the feeling of safety Ethan had found in Lily. Daniel wanted to say no, to remind his son that strangers couldn't simply step into their lives. But when he looked into Ethan's hopeful eyes, he found himself unable to deny him. "We'll see," Daniel said carefully, though his voice was heavy. He forced a smile. "Finish your pancakes first." Ethan smiled faintly and returned to his plate, though his hand still clung to Lily's as if afraid she might vanish if he let go. As Daniel watched them, guilt began to gnaw at him. He realized he had spent so many years convincing himself that giving Ethan a big house, expensive clothes, and the best schools was enough. But those things didn't hold his son when he was afraid. They didn't whisper words of comfort in the dark. They didn't make him feel safe when the world turned frightening. And it wasn't money Ethan had wanted under that table. It was love, attention, the steady reassurance that someone cared more about him than about anything else. Daniel lowered his gaze, ashamed. For all his power, he had been powerless when it mattered most. For all his success, he had failed where it mattered most. Lily gently pulled her hand from Ethan's, standing up as if to give father and son space. But Ethan reached for her again, his voice rising. "Please don't go yet." She hesitated, then sat back down. Daniel watched the exchange silently, his chest heavy. He wanted to reach across the table to take Ethan's hand himself, but he knew his son would pull away. It wasn't just the fear of the moment that had driven Ethan into Lily's arms. It was years of absence. Years of distance, years of Daniel choosing work over fatherhood. The realization sank deeper with every passing second. Daniel knew he could thank Lily 1,000 times, but it wouldn't erase the truth. His son trusted a stranger more than him, and that trust wasn't built in a single afternoon. It had been lost slowly, piece by piece. Every time Daniel failed to show up, every time he chose the boardroom over the dinner table, every time. He thought money could replace love. As Ethan finished the last bite of his pancakes, Daniel sat silently, making a decision inside himself. Something had to change. He could no longer keep telling himself that someday he would spend more time with his son. Someday had to be now, because if he didn't start now, he would lose Ethan forever, not in the way the men at the counter might have taken him, but in a quieter, deeper way, where the bond between father and son faded into nothing. Daniel looked at Ethan and Lily sitting side by side, and for the first time in years, he felt truly afraid, not of danger, not of losing money, but of losing the most important person in his life. And he knew, without a doubt, that nothing in the world was worth that risk. The days following the diner incident passed in a strange mix of quiet reflection and subtle chaos. Daniel felt a shift inside him, one that he had been avoiding for years. Every time he saw Ethan playing in the backyard, laughing without a care in the world, or even sitting quietly reading a book, he remembered the fear in his son's eyes that day under the table. That fear had cut deeper than anything he had ever felt in a boardroom or a negotiation. He realized that money could buy comfort, it could buy luxury, it could even buy safety in many ways, but it could never buy trust, love, or the simple, irreplaceable moments of being present for someone you care about. From the very next morning, Daniel made small changes, the kind that most people wouldn't notice, but that meant the world to a child. He started leaving his office earlier, even if it meant calling meetings over Zoom from home. He attended Ethan's school events, something he had neglected for far too long. He asked questions about his son's day, listened without distraction, even attempted to play games with him in the park, where the laughter was genuine and no one was thinking about deals or contracts. At first, Ethan was cautious. The boy had grown used to a certain distance, a pattern where his father's attention was fleeting. But Daniel persisted, patient, learning that love was not a matter of grand gestures, but of steady, consistent presence. Lily became an unexpected part of their lives. Daniel invited her over, not just as a courtesy, but because he realized that Ethan's bond with her had awakened something in his son that he couldn't ignore. She was humble, kind, and wise beyond her years in the ways that mattered. She didn't flaunt her courage, nor did she demand recognition. She simply cared for Ethan, and in doing so, reminded Daniel of the kind of father he wanted to be. At first, he had hesitated, unsure if bringing her into their life was appropriate. But seeing the joy on Ethan's face whenever Lily came over convinced him that some people were meant to enter our lives to heal the spaces we couldn't mend on our own. One evening, Daniel and Lily sat in the living room after Ethan had gone to bed. They spoke quietly, discussing what had happened in the diner and how deeply it had affected all of them. Daniel confessed the guilt that had been eating at him for years, the shame of realizing that his son had turned to a stranger for protection, when he, as a father, should have been the first line of comfort. Lily listened with patience, never judging, only encouraging him to recognize that awareness was the first step toward change. "You can't change the past," she said softly, "but you can be here now. You can choose to be the father he needs from this moment forward." Her words were simple, yet they struck Daniel in a way that nothing else had. He realized that bravery wasn't just for moments of life and death. It was also about confronting your own failings, facing your shortcomings, and making a conscious decision to do better. And in that quiet moment, Daniel made a promise to himself. He would never again let his son feel the absence of protection, love, or attention that day had exposed. Life slowly began to transform. Ethan's laughter became more frequent, his questions more open, his trust in his father gradually rebuilding. Daniel discovered joy in the mundane, the way Ethan's eyes lit up when they baked cookies together, the way he held his father's hand while walking through the park, the way he eagerly ran to show a drawing he had made. Each moment, though small, felt monumental because it was an acknowledgement that he was now a part of his son's world in a meaningful way. Business meetings, travel, and responsibilities still demanded Daniel's attention, but they no longer dictated the rhythm of his life. He learned to set boundaries, to prioritize moments over money, and to value presence over prestige. And though it was difficult at times, and though old habits threatened to pull him back into old patterns, he held firm. He had seen the consequences of absence, and he was determined not to repeat them. Ethan's connection with Lily also flourished. She became a trusted friend, someone who offered guidance and reassurance when needed, without ever overstepping. She taught Ethan resilience and empathy, and her gentle courage gave him a sense of security that Daniel had never fully understood before. Daniel watched their interactions with admiration, realizing that she had become a teacher not just for his son but for himself as well. One weekend, Daniel organized a small trip for just the three of them. They went to the countryside, a place far from the noise of the city, where the air was fresh and the trees stretched high into the sky. The days were filled with laughter, games, and quiet talks by the river. Daniel noticed how Ethan's eyes sparkled with wonder at the smallest things, a reminder that childhood was fleeting, and that each moment spent together was precious and irreplaceable. During that trip, Daniel found a quiet moment to speak to Lily. "Thank you," he said earnestly, "for stepping in that day, for showing me what it means to be brave, to be kind, and to be present. I don't know how to repay you." Lily shook her head, smiling softly. "You're doing it already," she said. "By being here, by choosing to be the father he needs, that's the greatest gift you can give him." In those moments, Daniel realized that life's wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts or assets. True wealth was measured in relationships, in trust, and in the love that a child feels when they know they are safe and cherished. He had spent so long chasing numbers, deals, and recognition, believing that success would define him. But now he understood that success without love was hollow. His son's happiness and security became his most treasured achievements. As months passed, the bond between Daniel and Ethan grew stronger. They faced small challenges, moments of misunderstanding, and occasional setbacks. But the foundation of trust had been established. Ethan learned to turn to his father first, knowing that he would be met with attention, understanding, and care. And Daniel, in turn, discovered a fulfillment he had never known in the boardroom or in the glittering towers of wealth. One evening, as Daniel watched Ethan and Lily planting flowers in the backyard, he felt a profound sense of peace. Fear, the guilt, and the shame that had haunted him for so long were finally giving way to gratitude, love, and hope. He realized that life could change in a single moment of courage, in a single act of protection, and in the willingness to step forward when it mattered most. Daniel understood that the events of that day in the diner had been a turning point, not just for his son, but for himself as well. He had been forced to confront his failures, to acknowledge his weaknesses, and to embrace the responsibility of being a father in its truest sense. And in doing so, he had discovered a strength and clarity that no amount of money or power could ever provide. From that day forward, Daniel made a conscious choice to be fully present, to nurture, and to cherish the moments he shared with Ethan, and in the warmth of his son's laughter, in the trust in his eyes, and in the quiet courage of Lily by their side, Daniel found a sense of fulfillment that transcended wealth. Status and successive fulfillment built on love, connection, and the simple, enduring bonds of family. Every night, when Daniel tucked Ethan into bed, he would sit beside him, hold his hand, and ask about his day. Ethan, now confident and secure, would recount his experiences, his triumphs, and even his worries. And Daniel would listen, truly listen, knowing that this was what mattered most. Through these acts, Daniel discovered a truth he could never have learned in boardrooms or in the pursuit of wealth. that life's greatest power lies not in what you control, but in the hearts you touch. And in touching his son's heart, Daniel had found a strength, a love, a purpose that would endure far beyond any fortune, far beyond any fleeting success, and far beyond the shadow of fear that had once defined their lives in the years that followed. Daniel, Ethan, and Lily built a life filled with trust, laughter, and shared experiences. They faced challenges together, celebrated victories, and comforted each other through hardships. And Daniel never forgot the lesson of that fateful day in the diner, the day when bravery, compassion, and presence changed everything, forging a bond that would last a lifetime.